Hi, in this video we're going to talk about ANSI null defaults. It's a database option available in Microsoft SQL Server. Like most of the other options that I've mentioned so far, this one also doesn't seem to really serve any purpose, and I'm going to demonstrate why exactly in a minute. Now, before we get started, it's a good idea to differentiate between ANSI null defaults versus ANSI nulls. So if you look at the database properties, you'll see that we've got two options over here. The first one says ANSI null default, and the second one says ANSI nulls. Now, ANSI null default is basically a property of the database that implements the logic in terms of how to treat a column's nullability if it's not already specified by the user during creation. So the question really is, what should the database do when you write a query like this? Is the column nullable or is it not nullable? Now, by default, the column is nullable, and that means this is what the database property looks like. Alter database set ANSI null default on. And when you do this, what happens is, if I create a table and if I query this, you'll see that it's a nullable column because I didn't specify anything here particularly. The other thing you want to notice is, now I'm going to go ahead and change this to ANSI null off, and I'm going to run this query again. And at that point, what you expect the database to do is create the table with the ID column being a not nullable column. However, you'll notice in this particular query now that it is still a nullable column, and we're going to go ahead and just look at the database table itself. So just a second. Right, it's a nullable column. So the question that you probably have in mind is, why is it still doing nullability when you've already told the database that it's a not nullable column? And I'm going to go ahead and show you the MSDN script as well really quick. So we've got this query here, and what they basically say is that the code from this point on demonstrates set ANSI null default on has an effect when ANSI null default of the database is false. If ANSI null default database option is set to false by executing alter database. So what they basically say here is that when you alter the database and you set ANSI null default off, you're supposed to be able to create a table just the way that I created it, but when you try to insert a null, the null fails. Let's go ahead and just try if we can do that really quick over here. So this is exactly the same thing that I'm already doing, but probably important to show you that the documentation also is not necessarily correct. So let me just go ahead and do that really quick. Right, so I'm going into my database called DB options. I'm setting it to default off, and then I try to insert data into the table T1. You see there in the comments it says null insert should fail, but it doesn't. So the question then becomes why, and the reason why that happens is because the database properties is overridden by the user's preferences when the session is established. So you will see that when I create a session, there are certain session level properties that get set, such as your ANSI nulls and your ANSI defaults, errata abort, etc. And those override your database preferences. So in this case, if I want to actually implement that feature or that behavior of ANSI nulls, what I should actually be doing is not setting it at the database level, because as you can see that doesn't work. Instead, I'm going to go ahead and do it over here. I'm going to say set ANSI null default off. As you can see here, they've kind of made that redundant because there's another one they called on as well. Essentially, they do the same thing. So I'm going to say that ANSI null defaults is off, and then I'm going to try and create a table called null off. So let me just go ahead and do that really quick. And when I do that, you'll see that now the nullability of the table is set to off, or the nullability of the column is set to off, even though I didn't specify anything over here. So the bottom line here is that this particular database option doesn't really work as a database option. It works as a session level parameter that you want to go ahead and set. So it's something that's done at the session level. At the database level, even though the buttons and all that exist, it doesn't actually work. Now, should you be using this is the next question, and frankly, no, you shouldn't be using it. When you create a table, common sense and good database design practices require you to specify nullability on your own, and more importantly, you shouldn't really have that many nullable columns in your database, mainly because if you do normalization properly, you shouldn't really have nulls. You should be able to default most of the values to something. So good database design requires that table shouldn't have nulls, and another thing is that when you design it, you will specifically qualify the nullability of the column rather than depend on the database to override your behavior. So keep that in mind the next time you create a table, and I hope this video has been informative. Thank you for watching.